Hi, this is Natalie with The Fifth Journey, and I made this video because of something that I'm often asked. When people see me at shows or they come into the shop, they always ask, how long does it take to make this? And I never have a good answer. So I decided to make a video really from scratch on making a woven item. So it goes from measuring out the warp to prepping the fabric, getting the loom set up completely from scratch with a new pattern, and the weaving, and then the finishing. So this took a very long time to do, and as you see through the video, I actually started this video a year ago because we were remodeling the craft room. You're going to see my kids, my husband, coming in and out because, this is a family space that we all use. So when you create something like a rug on a loom, you don't want to do something one at a time unless it's a sentimental piece or something you're going to keep, because of the amount of time it takes to set it up. It takes me, if I'm doing something standard, takes about 3 hours to set it up. So if somebody wants to buy something, adding that extra 3 hours of prep work, it's not cost effective. So on my big loom over here, this is the one that I make the rugs on, I usually put 13 to 14 yards on at a time, and I'll use that pattern, and then I may use that pattern for a while, just changing the colors, changing a little bit of the design. And then on this one I do smaller items. I do like hand towels and bread towels and scarves and table runners, and kind of the same thing. So I put quite a bit of yardage on so I can make multiple things, and then I'll change the color and a little bit of the pattern because, depending on how you have it set up, you can change patterns. And so this video, it's a little bit over 30 minutes, as you'll notice that I have fast forwarded big time through it to get through it, because it's about 33 hours of actual video that I recorded. And again, it's totally from scratch, but it doesn't include buying the material and anytime that things quit recording or troubleshooting or times I simply forgot to record. So it's a lot of time that it takes, and if you make things, you understand the process. But if you don't, this will give you kind of an idea of what we go through when something is created for you, and maybe give you an appreciation for it. So just a little background, my mother, well actually my dad was a potter for 40 years, so he did handmade decorative and functional pottery. That's what I grew up with. My mother did weaving, and she actually took classes at Oriole, and they used to have summer seminars, so she did that back in the 70s. I was able to take weaving in high school, and then in 2004 I started doing art shows, and I did that for a little while, and then after having children I kind of did it on and off, and now I'm doing it again a little bit more there. So the items that I made in this video were from my home, so they're more specialized pieces, and I'm not going to get really up close and personal with the actual weaving of the pattern because there's so much content, but this will give you kind of an idea of what happens when you get something. It's like, oh, that's how it's made. So going completely from scratch, from doing the pattern and measuring everything out, prepping the material, and going from there. So this will give you a good idea of how it goes. So I'm going to go ahead and go over to the video. I will do a little bit of a voiceover explaining a little bit of what's going on, but it'll give you a good idea from start to scratch. And then, stay tuned for future videos, because I will do some more videos, a little bit more personal, where it's the actual pattern so you can see the actual weaving. So make sure you look out for those for future. And I appreciate you watching. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll see you soon.
Once you have chosen your color pathway, you will want to get fabric that is in long pieces. I try to get sheets or long bolts of fabric. I personally prefer to use cotton blends as I tear my fabric. Some people do cut it, but tearing works well for me. I do this outside. I take the fabric, fold it in half, and then I cut it in about 1 to 2 inch strips and then rip it from there. You'll want to make sure that you pre-wash your fabric to take out any sizing, because you don't want to have something and then once your rug is finished go and wash it and it shrinks or disforms when you do wash it. So you want to make sure that you pre-wash it, and then when I cut it I go ahead and angle each piece at the very end so that when I put the fabric together when I'm weaving I have a nice seam. Some people do choose to sew every piece together. I personally don't, but you can find whatever works best for you. When you're choosing your fabric, you want to make sure that you are picking about the same type of fabric, the same weight for the entire rug, you don't want to mix really thick fabrics with like a stretchy fabric, because as they wear or as you wash them, they won't wash the same. Now you can do textures, but you want to make sure that they don't stretch differently or wash differently. And when you cut the strips, if it's a fine or a thin fabric, you'll cut your strips a little wider, and if it's a thick fabric like a corduroy, then your strips will be narrow. Now, I said that you do want to rip this outside, choose a windy day, because it does kick up a lot of dust. So, you know, again, wash your fabric, and then if you choose to tear it, you'll definitely want to do it outside on a breezy day. When I'm doing a weaving project, I try to get all of my fabric prepped at once, so I'm not having to constantly go back and forth. And you know, sometimes maybe I'll do the measuring of the warp first if it's maybe not a nice day, but I try to get as much of the pre-work done as I can, so I'm not having to go back and forth. And it's, you know, just get it done, it's over with, and it's ready to go ahead and wrap on your shuttles. When measuring your warp, you'll want to use a warp board. It speeds up the process when you're measuring out 200, 300, 400 pieces of yarn, and they're all the same length. So this one goes about 14 yards, and I usually do multiple colors, so I will do 5 spools of warp at a time just to save time. And I can get it on there, take it over to my loom, get it ready to go. But this is definitely an imperative piece to have if you're going to be a weaver. And I go ahead and when I measure things out, I divide it out with just simple twist ties. If I have different colors, it helps me count and keep a good idea of what I have. Dressing the loom is probably the most time-consuming and tedious part of the whole weaving process, because if you make one tiny mistake, it will ruin the design of every single piece that you have set up to do that. So you'll want to make sure that you triple check everything when you're putting it on. So the first step is putting the warp through the reed. It is a metal piece that fits into the front beater bar, and it has little tiny narrow slats in it. And this has different sizes depending on how wide it is, how thick your yarn is, and kind of what your design is. So they come in 8, 10, and 12, and 15 dent reeds, and that's basically how many spaces there are per inch. And if you're doing something like a fine scarf, you'll sometimes put 2 pieces of yarn in each one. So say if you have something that is 24 EPI, that is 24 ends per inch, that's ends of yarn, and you just have a 12 dent reed, you would put 2 pieces of yarn between each one of those holes. But it's a really good idea to pick one depending on your size, and it really helps determine how thick things are, how even it is, and keeps everything evenly spaced. So you want to make sure that you are choosing the right one for what you're using. Now here I'm actually taking off the frames that hold the heddles, and this is something that I really rarely do, and it's not exactly a fun thing to do because you really have to take everything apart. But with the pattern that I'm using, it's a much wider rug and it's using extra harnesses, so I have to take the heddles off and add some on to some of the frames. And this is something you do need to do from time to time, but not very often. So I have to go through and do it on each one. The heddles are what you put the yarn through once you're done with the reed, warping the reed, and that is one of the steps that decides your pattern. So this is the one where you need to make sure that you have it in the correct harness or the correct shaft. So each one of those frames is on a harness or a shaft, depending on what part of the world you're in determines what it is called. And you know, so if you hear it, sometimes interchangeable. Technically here in the US it is supposed to be called a shaft, but I grew up and a lot of my books call them harnesses. So if you hear it either way, and this particular loom is an 8 harness or an 8 shaft loom. So here I have all of the frames with the correct heddles on, and I always push the heddles over to one side and start on that side. So as you can see, this is from the back view. I'm doing the pattern, so each one I have a little checkbook or a little notebook that has my pattern on it, and I mark it off once I'm done with it. And when I have, I don't know, depending on how thick the yarn is, I will tie the bundles up at the end, because you'll need to do that to tie it up to the fabric or however you have the back beam set up. So this part, make sure you have no distractions, make sure you have plenty of time if you're doing any type of intricate pattern, so you don't mess it up, because it's not fun when you get everything on there and you start weaving only to discover that you have to take it apart. Some things, which I will actually show you later, I did mess up on one and it was an easy fix. Sometimes you'll have a little mess up on an end and that's not a big deal, but man, when you have one in the middle where you repeated the pattern too many times, you have to take it all out up to that point. So that's definitely not a fun thing. Now for this particular pattern that I'm doing, it's called a summer winter, where it's kind of an overshot. So the pattern will be different on one side versus the other, and this is a 4 shaft or a 4 harness. So my loom has 8, and I'm actually using the back 4. The front 4 I have set up for a different pattern. So when I'm done with this pattern, then I can just tie them off and weave using the front one. So I can kind of go back and forth between the patterns on here. So I'm almost done with that, checking everything over. If you're in the market for a loom, you want to make sure that it's something that you can easily warp. Now this particular loom, because it is so big, I literally have to crawl inside of it to warp it, and especially on the back side. Now some of them you can push away from the wall, so again you want to have extra space, but what I'm leaning against, that's the back beam. You want to be able to easily move it around. And here where I had tied the knots, I tied it onto the fabric that's attached to the back beam, and I'm going to go ahead and start winding it on from there. It would be good to mention that there are several different ways to dress or warp a loom. You can do it from front to back as I'm doing it, or you can actually do it from back to front. And definitely they both have their pros and cons. It just depends on what you prefer to do. Some of the looms have ways that you can put on a lot of warp, and so those ones you would definitely warp from back to front. And this is just a personal preference of mine, and I'm sure some people may cringe at kind of the messy warp that I have, but this works for me and I can actually go a lot faster this way. There are sticks that you can use called leaf sticks that will aid in the warping process, but the issue, or as why they don't work for me, because when I am measuring out my warp, I will use 3, 4, 5, 6 spools at a time. And if you're doing it one thread at a time, it works wonderfully. It keeps the knots out. But when I do it the way I do it, the warping on the warp board, the measuring out goes a lot faster. And this, getting the knots out, it's really not so bad. So have it all separated out. And also the nice thing about it, when I'm doing it this way or from the front, every time I pull on it, it makes it even in the back, because you want to try to have all those threads on there as even as possible when you're warping it onto the back beam. Otherwise you are going to have uneven threads. And here I'm almost done, so I go ahead and get out the last little bits and I trim the ends to make sure everything is nice and even before I tie in the front. I do a square knot when I am tying the warp on the front, and I do a single knot first, and then I feel along the entire length of it and then tighten it up as needed, and then I do the second knot. Next is tying up the treadles, and this is another part of the pattern. So each one of those, you can see this particular loom has lots and lots of hooks, and there are ropes that tie on to each one. So each one of the treadles, which that's a pedal, has, for this particular pattern, I can tie up 2 different ones on there, and as you can see, I'm pressing them down to make sure that they go to the correct one. And the nice thing about this is you can do a tie up on the heddles and change how the treadles are for different patterns within the same, even the same rug. Here I had a mistake, and I had grabbed a heddle on completely the wrong harness. So this one was a super easy one. I'm just going to clip it off. It's wire, so I'll clip it off and move it on back to the correct one. So this again is a super easy mistake, and looms generally come with an extra couple hundred or more of the heddles, so that's not too bad of a mistake there. And I just grabbed the one right in front of it. There's a stray one that was floating around, so I got that fixed really quick on that. Now on to the fun part, the actual weaving. So first thing, remember how we had ripped all that fabric. So I go ahead and put it into piles. Since I'm going to be doing 2 different rugs, I put the colors out of the way that I'm not going to use, and I'm doing 2 different shuttles at a time. So I'm going to have 2 different color pathways with this. So I go ahead and get a comfortable seat and warp my shuttles, wrap my shuttle, excuse me, with alternating fabrics. At this point, some people do go ahead and sew the ends, but as I am weaving, I will overlap those ends by several inches, and like I said before, I do go ahead and clip it off. This part, if you have a nice day, I would recommend doing it outside, as there is some fuzz and dust that does happen while you're doing this. If not, you know, it's fine. You can do it inside, and you'll want to wrap up as many of the shuttles that you have, and these are rag shuttles. I have several different types. I have rustic handmade ones versus nicer ones that were bought at weaving stores. There are different types of shuttles depending on what you're doing. There are ones that you put in a large bobbin type thing, and there's ones that are flat. So there's a lot of different types that you can use. And then the weaving part in this is the best part, actually. So when you are weaving, you want to put on a section of basically throwaway, because you're going to have warp that you'll need to either tie or sew, and you'll need to put filler in. And you want to make sure you have your pattern somewhere nice and handy, and a pencil nearby or some way of marking things. And I can't remember exactly what they're called, but they're these little hooks that are used in like crocheting or knitting, and I use those if I'm doing a long pattern to mark about every 12 inches or every 2 feet or so, just to keep an idea of how far I've gone. So that's something really handy. You want to have a tape measure nearby to measure your progress as you go, and comfortable seat and whatever works best for you. Actually, talking about seats really quick, because this part's going to take a while. One of the best seats that you can find that's very inexpensive is a keyboarding seat, or somebody or a seat that is used by someone who basically plays a keyboard. So hop online, type in keyboarding bench or keyboard bench, and you'll be able to find something very inexpensive. The seat that I'm using right there is actually a weaving one, and those are very expensive, and I had to get a pad for it because it's not very comfortable. But on the keyboard bench, the keyboarding bench, they are adjustable depending on what you're using and how high your loom is. When you are weaving, your proper height should be about elbow height. So if you're sitting there with your arms at your sides, you want that beam to be at about the bottom of your elbows. So you want to adjust your seat accordingly. And some looms you can do standing up, and actually it's kind of a nice break to weave standing up every now and then changing feet. If you notice, I don't have any shoes on because that makes your foot base a lot wider. And when you're weaving, you don't want to be constantly looking down to figure out which treadle you're pushing down. And without shoes on, you can feel to see which pedal you're on, and you can count from there. And just like riding a bike, once you've been doing it for a while, you just know. You know which one you're pushing down. You don't have to think about it too much. There are some patterns where you're going to be pushing down two of them at the same time. So you have to have a lot of leverage to be able to push them down at the same time. So this part is, again, the most fun. The actual weaving, this is my favorite part, the creation process of it. This particular loom has something called worm gears, W-O-R-M gears, and it has kind of a crank. So it has a big gear on the back one that I unwind, and then a gear on the front one that I wind up from there. So it makes it really nice and easy to tighten up evenly. And you can't have too many shuttles. I probably have a lot, but when you're doing a big project like this, you have to stop to re-warp your shuttles to continue going. And as you see, I do have a cat that likes to help with these while I'm weaving. So this, I'm just continuing on with whatever pattern that you're using, marking it off. There I did have a thread that broke. So usually you have to have a knot or something in there because if you're doing 14 yards or how many yards at a time, there is a chance for waste, or sometimes a thread will break. It just happens. Sometimes there's a weak spot, or there's already a knot there, or you're changing colors. As I said earlier, when I am doing weaving projects, I usually do anywhere from 10 to 13 rugs at a time. So that's when I put on the full 13 to 14 yards. And when I finish the ends, I put in a filler of about 6 to 7 inches of scrap fabric, and then I cut it through the middle, and then I tie them off. So basically I take, depending how many ends per inch I do, it's usually about 6 to 8 ends, and then I go ahead and tie those in a knot. And I do, of course, a little filler of, so when I start or finish a rug, I have a small filler of matching warp that either matches the rug or matches the other warp colors. And depending on what I'm doing, I'll do maybe a 1/2 inch, and then 6 inches of filler, and then a 1/2 inch before I start the other rug. Now on this particular rug, or if I'm doing something a little different, I will do maybe 2 to 3 inches of woven warp threads on there so that I can serge it, which is what I'll be doing with this one. I'll serge the end, fold it over, and then sew it for a nice end. Or you can use a piece of fabric that is complementary and sew that over the warp as well. There's a lot of other designs. So if you're doing something like a scarf that has usually longer ends, longer fringe on them, you can do a lot of different knot patterns. So you can braid, you can twist, you can do a lot of really neat patterns on there. You can even crochet the ends, lots of different ideas for how you want to finish them. And you can even do, when you're weaving, you can do something called inlays, where if you do a basic or a plain fabric, you can just lay in bright pops of color, or if you have a room you can that you're trying to match, you can put in colors just inlaid in there. You can do patterns. So think of like a simple Christmas tree pattern. If you have a rug that is a plain rug, and you just put in smaller sizes as you go up of, say, pieces of green fabric to make like a Christmas tree. So you do like an inlay that way. So think about designs like that. There's actually weaving patterns you can do, or you can do a plain weave and do it with that design. So the possibilities are truly endless. And even using the same fabrics with different colored warp, or the same work with different colored fabrics, you can get totally different color pathways and different designs. So as you saw in the little text right there, I took a very long break. I had a foot injury because I teach dance as well, and I had a foot injury, so I was out about 8 weeks with that, and I really couldn't weave because I was in a boot for a long time. So as you can see, it's a lot warmer, and we're back at it. So as I was saying earlier, this rug took, these two rugs, excuse me, took quite a long time. And if you've noticed, the little kitchen area in the back has changed a lot too. We're almost done with the space, which is nice, and the kids are able to use it. But this is the great thing about having a space like this. If you're able to do this, to have a place for people to create. It used to be in one of the bedrooms, but one of the girls has that bedroom now. But it's good for everybody to have the mental break to be creative. Whatever you do, if it's drawing or singing or anything, you know, have a little bit of a space. It doesn't have to be big. But if everything is so fast-paced and so stressful now, it's nice to have a little bit of a place to go so you can get away from the computer, get away from everything, and use a different part of your brain. This is why I like doing this, because, you know, in our real jobs, it's high stress, doing accounting and a lot of things like that, and the gardening and the weaving, the soap making, everything, the dancing, it uses a completely different part of my brain, and it allows that other side to rest. So I'm still busy, I'm still doing things, but it is allowing different parts of my brain to do different things, and it's very enjoyable to me. It's not work. So you want to try to find things in your life that do give you happiness, and, you know, be creative. That's one of the best ways to do it. When choosing the size of your woven item, you want to make sure that you account for shrinkage both in length and in width. So on the size of the rug for width, you will have something called draw in. And when you're weaving, the actual act of weaving does pull in the sides a little bit. It also depends on your material and what your final project is going to be. And on the length, because the warp threads are stretched and you want to have it tight, it does stretch that material. So depending on if you're using cotton or if you're doing something synthetic that does have a little bit of give to it, you want to make sure and account for that extra movement in the threads. So for instance, on these rugs that I am making, the two rugs, the final dimensions are, for the kitchen one is 87 inches by 42 inches, which is about 7 foot 3 inches by 3 feet 6 inches, and the hallway rug is 148 inches by 42 inches, so about 12 feet 4 inches and 3 feet 6 inches. So when I actually set up the loom, the final width on those is about 42 inches once I take them off the loom. But using a 10 dent reed, that's 10 ends per inch, I put on 455 ends. So that is 45.5 inches across. But you know, when I take it off, I did lose about 3 inches on that. And then on the length, you do have quite a bit of waste. You have the waste from when you start the weaving, because you have to tie it on, then you have that little bit of header. And then if you look at the back of the loom, you obviously can't weave that, so you have to take an account of how much yardage of warp that you're going to have on the back that will be wasted. If you're doing something like a hand towel or a bread towel that you're going to wash before using or before selling, obviously it's going to shrink if it's 100% cotton. Now earlier I said if you're doing a rug or something, you want to wash it beforehand. Obviously you can't throw a spool of yarn into the wash because you'll have a mess. So when I'm making a bread towel, I will, for instance, I will weave 32 inches, but then once I sew it and finish the ends and wash it before selling, I'm down to about 22, 24 inches. So you lose a good 8 to 10 inches in that process when you are weaving. Going on with that, you want to be especially careful if you're using synthetic yarns like rayon. So if you're making scarves or something similar, you really have to take that into account. I made the mistake on a batch of scarves where I had woven them. I think I was like 70 some odd inches, and then I took them off and they were only maybe like 45 or 50, and that does not make a very good scarf when you're doing that. So you really take into account to the materials that you're using and the finished project. You really have to think about that when you're doing it. Now I'm going to talk about looms really quick. When you have a big loom like this, you need to either have some type of grippy pads on the bottom or pieces of carpet. Some people even screw them into place because they do walk. So when you're watching me weave in this next little section, every time you beat the fabric, because you do have to beat it pretty hard to get the fabric in and the yarns in, the loom does walk. So you can see it moving forward every time I beat the rug. And you want to protect your floor, so putting something down, even with the grippy pads that I have underneath the loom, it still does walk some. And something else to think about is some patterns, you do want to have some earplugs because it can be very, very loud when you are pressing into place, because if you don't push that yarn or the fabric or whatever you're using into place, it'll make a weak or a flimsy rug, and you don't really want to have that because then it can fall apart. In the future you want to have a well-made product, and they can last a long time. I have rugs that I made back in high school that I still use. We made it, the rugs are done, so I'm going to go ahead and cut them off, unwind them. I do leave enough warp on there so I can use that same pattern again, and you can see how big that roll is and how wide it is. So the first thing I'm going to do is serge the ends, and I am doing this on the floor because it is such a heavy and a big rug, or two of them rather. So I go ahead and serge the ends, and then I measure out fabric to sew over that. If you can kind of see, I do sew two pieces together, complementary colors, and then I iron them flat and then iron a little 1/4 inch edge over. I go ahead and fold in that woven piece. So on the ends I have that the woven warp, so about 3 inches long. I fold that in half or in thirds, and then I go ahead and pin on the fabric, the complementary fabric, to go ahead and sew on. So I fold over the, fold it in half, and then I fold over a nice line or nice seam on the end and sew it in. And like I said, because these are so big, I do need to sew on the floor because I don't really have a table space that is big enough to lay these out and efficiently sew them. So you know what, this works fine. Just have to deal with the pesky critters and go from there. When I am sewing these, I make sure to do a good back stitch at the beginning, and then I do a straight stitch all the way through, sometimes twice, and then I go ahead and finish with a zigzag stitch, because you want to make sure that you get all of those pieces of thread, the pieces of warp in there, so it's nice and secure, and so it lasts a long time, so you don't have to go back and mend it later on.
We're finally done. I have them woven and sewn and everything is set. The rug to the right is an existing rug, and it has some very subtle patterns to it, but I went ahead and finished this one. So this one goes between the fridge and the oven, and let's go ahead and take a look. So we've got this one done, and this one combines fabric from the rug that we just looked at and then the new hallway rug. You'll see my cat, and there, see how long it is? That is the new hallway one. So this one will match the colors better, because the one I had done before had more of the blues, but here we have it. So this is a long rug, and it's a little bit wider than the one that I had made here before, but it looks good. There we have it.
I wanted to add this on at the end. This is the pattern that I used. I had expanded it from a scarf or a hand towel pattern and made it quite a bit bigger, and also has different variations to make different designs. But that gives you an idea of what a pattern looks like, as well as notes to do the actual weaving.